Hey all, Motochiba back here with the promised video on how to take care of your tubes in your sweet, sweet tube amp. Check out my other video on what's going on in the tube industry. I'll put the link in the description, which is probably down here somewhere. And that applies to March 2022, and who knows how long in the future. We'll find out. And if you want to, be sure to like, subscribe, ask questions, and all that kind of stuff. Without further ado, here are 10 tips for prolonging the life of the tubes in your favorite tube amp. Tip number 1, turn your amp down. While most tubes are designed for long life, like anything else, the harder you push them, the less time they will last. Drop the gain a little, drop the volume a lot while you're at it. And who knows, in addition to some extra tube life, you might just discover some other sounds that you like. Tip number 2, standby. Use that standby switch. The standby switch is there literally to protect your tubes in that high voltage circuit inside your tube amp. If your amp has what looks like 2 side-by-side power switches, right here, one even says power and one says standby. This one, power, standby. It's very obvious. One of them is the power switch and the other one is the standby switch. Now there are some amps that only have one switch and it's a simple on-off switch. There are other amps that have a 3-position switch where standby is the middle position and on is the 3rd position. And when you want to use your amp, turn the power switch to on and wait for at least 30 seconds. You don't need to wait for more than a minute though. So you don't have to let your amp warm up for 13 or 15 or 27 minutes. Once your amp is warmed up, and that's literally what it's doing, flip the standby switch to on and start playing. Tip number 3, boom. Boom. Get your amp biased. Amp techs are a little hard to find, so ask around, ask your guitar playing buddies. Even you could call a local music store and ask if they know anybody that services amps. What biasing your amp does is properly tweak the whole circuit to provide the optimum voltage to the power tubes. If your bias is set too high, we call that running hot, your amp might sound extra spicy, but those tubes are going to wear out faster. Now, if your amp bias is set too low, we call that running cold. Your tubes might last a little bit longer, but your amp is not going to sound as good as it should. A properly biased amp not only makes your amp sound as good as it can, but it helps your tubes last as long as they can. So when you find a good amp tech, by the way, this is a bonus tip, pay their going rate, don't argue about it, and tip them every now and then, just like you would a server or a tattoo artist or anybody else that provides an important critical service. The better your relationship with your amp tech is, the longer your amps are going to last and the better they're going to sound, whether they have tubes in them or not. Tip number 4, plug your speaker cabinet in before you power up your amp. Not only can this save your tubes, it can also prevent damage to your output transformer. That's one of the biggest hunks of metal inside your amp. The speakers are part of the amp's circuit, and for most amps, if they're not present when the amp is powered on, things get a little screwy in there until their speakers are plugged in, and then that is a shock to the system if you plug it in while the amp's already on. You'll also want to make sure that you're using a high-quality speaker cable. A speaker cable is not a regular guitar cable. It's a specific speaker cable, and you want to use those between your amp and your speaker cabinet, and check it regularly to make sure that it doesn't crackle, it's not cutting out, it doesn't have rips or tears in the insulation, and that the tips on the ends of the plugs are nice and clean and straight. Tip number 5, match your speaker and amp impedances. Make sure your speaker cabinet is properly matched to your amp's impedance. Some amps have separate jacks for each impedance, while others have a single jack and an impedance selector. If your amp is only set up to put out 4 or 8 ohms, don't use a 16 ohm speaker cabinet. This includes if you use a power soak or a power attenuator. Make sure you use one specifically designed to have the same ohm load as your amp requires. Tip number 6, let your amp cool off before you start moving it around. Now those tubes are filled with metal, and a good bit of that metal is these super thin pieces called filaments. Take a look at a clear light bulb sometime, not an LED light bulb, a regular light bulb, and you'll see tiny little wires inside it, and those are called filaments. Those little thin pieces of wire are what does a lot of the work, whether it's a light bulb or a vacuum tube. And it actually just kind of occurred to me that light bulbs are a type of vacuum tube, which I don't realize. I don't know why I didn't know that before. I don't know. Anyway, as you can probably guess, when they're hot, they're a little more malleable than cold, and that means they're more likely to break when they're still hot. By letting your amp cool off before you move it, you're protecting those filaments and therefore prolonging the life of your tubes. You've probably got at least, say, 15 minutes between the end of your set and the start of the next band's set. So turn your amp off immediately when you're done playing, clear out all your other gear first, and then go back and get your tube amp last. It only takes a few minutes for them to cool down. They're not, giant chunks of metal that absorb super amounts of heat. So it only takes a few minutes. Now, if you should ever happen to drop your amp or knock it over or pull it down, you should check each tube carefully before you turn the amp on again. If you have access to a tube tester, use that. Otherwise, you just want to make sure that they're well seated in their sockets and that nothing inside them looks visibly broken. Tip number 7, be nice to your amps. Treat your amps like you treat your guitars. What I mean by this is don't leave them outside in freezing cold or super humid storage spaces, that kind of thing. Not only is humidity bad for the wood housing in your amp, it makes it swell, but high humidity can cause corrosion on the metal parts of the amp, and that can damage the circuitry. Damaged circuitry can cause tube damage by disrupting the signal flow inside the amp or causing the tubes to run hotter than they should, which, as I'm sure you've guessed by now, shortens their life. I realize this sucks when you get home at 3 in the morning in the middle of January and you just want to shower the cigarette stench off of you and get some sleep. But you wouldn't leave your guitar in your car overnight like that, so don't leave your amp out there either. Tip number 8, keep your amps clean. This tip applies mostly to open back amps and amps that might sit around for a long time. If you have an open back amp that sits around for a long time, that's a double whammy. You want to keep dust and things like cobwebs off of your tubes. Debris like that might seem harmless, but it absorbs heat. And in serious cases, it can prevent the tubes from operating at the proper temperature, which absolutely will shorten their lives. You can help prevent the buildup of dust inside your open-backed amps by keeping a cover on it when you're not using it. That's pretty simple. Tip number 9, use the right tubes. When you do finally have to change the tubes in your amp, be sure to use the ones that are specified by the manufacturer. Now there are some caveats, so hold on. This is especially critical for your power tubes, but depending on the amp's design, it can also be important for preamp tubes. Different types of preamp tubes have different amounts of power available. We call that power gain. The tube most experts agree is at the top of the gain structure is the good old 12AX7. There are other 12-7 types of tubes available, like 12AT7, 12AU7, 12AY7. Those are the most popular. They all have less gain than the AX7 version, and they're used for different purposes in different parts of the amp circuit. Now, if your amp has built-in tremolo, vibrato, or reverb, chances are those parts of the circuit are powered by tubes with lower gain than the 12AX7. Now that's not hard and fast. Some amps, like my twin tone right here, powers the reverb with a 12AX7. There you go. But not all of them do, and some of them are specifically designed for those lower gain tubes. And so replacing them with the same type of tube not only provides optimum circuit performance, but it makes sure that your amp and all the tubes in it are running at the proper temperature, which extends life. Now, here's the caveat. Some amp circuits are designed to be able to handle higher or lower gain tubes in various places. Check with your manufacturer. You could always read the owner's manual if you want to try tubes with different gain levels in different spots. Doing that is a pretty effective way, especially in a vintage amp, to fine-tune the sound more to your taste. A perfect example of this is any number of amps using a 12AX7 in the phase inverter spot. This is the point in the circuit that the sound crosses over from the preamp to the power amp, and it does exactly what it says. It inverts the phase of the signal. If you think your amp sounds harsh, for example, especially at high gain levels, you can try using a lower gain tube in the phase inverter section to tame that harshness just a little bit. What you never want to do, however, is go the other direction. If your phase inverter is a 12AT7, for example, don't replace it with a 12AX7. Not only is your amp not going to sound good, but you could actually damage the circuit. Now, there are some amps out there that are designed to take multiple types of power tubes. For instance, some of the Mesa Boogie amps can take either an EL34 or a 6L6 in their power section. What you need to do is, once again, read the owner's manual where they give you instructions on what you need to do when you do that. It may be as simple as flipping a switch inside the amp or turning a pot with a screwdriver that's inside the amp, but you also may need to take the amp to a amp technician and have it rebiased. As a matter of fact, you probably ought to have it rebiased if you're changing power amp tube types anyways. Tip number 10, use matched power tubes. This last tip is to, whenever possible, use matched power tubes. It doesn't matter if you're using 6L6, 6V6, EL34, EL84, or any other power tube. Using 2 or 4 matched tubes in the power section will provide not only the best sound of your amp, but the longest life for your tubes. Usually it's called a matched pair if there's 2, and a matched quad if there's 4. Now, what matching tubes means is finding 2 or 4 tubes that all test in the same narrow voltage range. It mostly doesn't matter what that range is as long as it's consistent between the tubes. What matters is that the tubes are all close together in their capabilities. Not only does this make biasing the amp easier for the technician, but it makes your amp sound better and more consistent, so the tubes will all degrade at the same rate over time. Now, provided, of course, that all the manufacturing is consistent in the tubes and you don't lose one in the middle of a show sometime. So there's always exceptions and things like that. But in general, using matched tubes is going to give you the best performance and the most consistent sound over the life of the tubes. Most tube retailers provide matching services for a nominal additional cost, maybe $5 or $10, $5 for a pair, $10 for a quad, something like that. And if you're looking to prolong the life of your precious tubes, it's all well worth the extra little bit of money. That's the end of the tips. Thanks for watching, and I hope you feel free to ask questions about tubes in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them, or at least direct you to a resource where you can get an answer. For what it's worth, I'm not an amp tech, just somebody who has studied amp circuitry for a long time and done a fair amount of amp repairs on my own, to my own amps, and I am a lifelong tube amp fan. Although I do have I take that back. I have 2 solid state amps, and I actually like both of them. One is a Line 6 amp called a Duo Verb, and one is a Fender amp called the M80 Chorus. Not the most popular amp in the world, but it has an amazing clean channel. The crunch channel, not really all that good, but the clean channel is fantastic, and the built-in chorus is wonderful. I know some folks, especially some of the big YouTube guitar gods, a lot of them use the trendiest modeling amps, but I don't know anything about modeling amps other than that they're designed to sound like the great tube amps that we all love. And apparently, some of them do a pretty good job at it. I spend enough time fiddling with computers, so I'm not really super interested in modeling amps, but that's a story for another time. Have fun, play well, and I'll see you around.